Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of Home Education Matters. And today is a very different style of podcast because today I am here chatting with Helen, who is a long-time home educator. And we hooked up, as you do, online. Actually, that sounds really dubious, but you know what I mean. We hooked up in a good way, in a friend's way. And
absolutely.
Exactly. And we decided that we were going to do a kind of personal opinion podcast. So think Boris Johnson's column in the Telegraph and think Jeremy Clarkson. I don't even know where these columns are, but I'm guessing, and I don't want to make assumptions, I'm guessing this will be slightly less right-wing, but just as enjoyable. So I'm hoping that today's podcast will be a really interesting personal perspective on home education from somebody who has been doing it a long time and somebody who has pretty good and strong opinions about a number of things within the home education community. So first of all, Helen, hello, thank you so much for joining us. And do tell our listeners a little bit about you, about your home education journey and about some of the opinions you formed on the way.
Yes, I am. I'm in my 40s, my late 40s. I am a home educator, only one. I'm what you would definitely call an unwilling home educator. I didn't, although I did do attachment parenting, and I breastfed my daughter until she was almost 4 and did a whole load of other things that you would think would lead to home education. I was so excited to send her to school. Just the thought of 6 hours break a day, I was just like, wow, I'll get this chance to have some time back. Also, my daughter never slept properly. So by the time she was 4.5-ish, I was so ready to even just have a nap in the middle of the day. I didn't realise that was going to go on more or less forever. And that even teen years wise, she's not a liar in as a general rule. So yes, then I sent her to preschool, like the proper nice preschool round the corner, the one where all the middle class families sent their children. It literally was the closest to me, and everyone was like, "Oh, you're so lucky! You're so close to this preschool." And it was on the same year that they brought in the new EYFS for preschool. And I remember preschool, I've done teacher training, so I remember preschool as this monster DOS. You'd like, as a secondary teacher, you'd look in, you'd be like, no way, can you draw a salary for colouring over like leaves with a crayon? That's like technically, but it blew my mind because I am not a primary natural in the slightest. And primary was just this really slow moving, gentle evolution. It used to be occupied usually either by very young women who'd like just taken a route that was just not quite nursery nursing, but in that general direction, and a whole cadre of older ladies who perhaps used to be primary teachers who are seeing in retirement and beyond. They were gentle, they were patient, they were sweet, the classes were small, it was colourful, it was non-demanding. And the EYFS from 2014 set off a bomb inside primary education, in my opinion. In fact, it was part of a larger curriculum shift across the board, which just destroyed education even further. It wasn't like education was a proud example of great practice in Britain, but wow, that year seemed to just destroy it. And so when my daughter went, I was stunned. It was like regimented, and the children had to queue up outside. There was no playing before you got there, unless you got there like before the teachers got there. It was super controlled. The classes were huge. It was 2 classes of 15, but they were amalgamated, so the room was really small. The space was the only way to describe it was something between fetid and stuffy, because some of these children didn't have bowel control yet. So you'd walk in and you'd be like, wow, that smell. And my daughter loved the person that we went to preschool with. And one of the saddest things, they're only 3.5 when they started this, they separated them out straight away. They were just like, they'd grown up together and they got separated out. I was really ill across that year. So that 3 hours of preschool for 38 weeks of the year was a godsend, because I got to attend appointments and do all sorts of other things. But it became more and more obvious as the year went by that she was being, it was almost year 1 level of pressure. So they were monitoring her really carefully. And when she became obvious she was going to be quite an early reader, they just diverted her off reading because she was bending vowel, consonant, vowel words and interested in words and sitting and staring at books, clearly trying to decode the actual words. And they just diverted her onto writing. And she didn't have anything like the level of skill yet for writing. And actually learning to write, in my opinion, and I'm sure it's backed elsewhere, is usually goes in lockstep with hitting the exact right amount for each individual child of physical activity. And because I've been a really sick parent all her life, she was behind on physical activity. She hadn't done enough climbing, running, all the things you need to build up to get those synapses to burn from your brain through to your hand. And so I sort of got more and more disillusioned, but we plodded through the year. And then the primary applications went through, and I applied to three primaries, went to the sort of like open day things they do, and they were so depressing. They were just like, on one level, I was excited to think I would get some proper time, not slotting it between 9 and 12 or 9 and 1 if you stayed for lunch. But on the other hand, it was just depressing. It was even, reception was sadder than I remember it being when I did my teacher training. And it was kind of boring. And again, I sat in a meeting where my daughter's summer-born, just on the cusp, but just summer-born. And I sat in with meetings with other parents with much younger children and little boys who were even less mature, less able to cope. It was little boys particularly that year. They really stood out, not able to cope with the social pressure, not able to cope with the actual volume of activity. And the mums were saying, would he still be able to have a nap in the afternoon? Because otherwise his behaviour is going to deteriorate. And they said no. And I asked if we could have a half day until year 1. And they said no.
So these were 4-year-olds, were they?
Yeah, these are for 4-year-olds.
So young, isn't it? So young.
It is, and the regimentedness of it, like and they said the EYFS cannot be delivered in a half day because the EYFS covers preschool and reception. That they were confident, even though they didn't know my daughter, that it couldn't be covered in half a day. I mean, this is like preschool learning. More hours do not equal greater quality.
The EYFS is the early years curriculum that they brought in.
Early years. I forgot what the FS stands for now. Oh God, I went on about it so much.
I can think of a few things.
Yeah,
but yeah, it probably doesn't stand for those things.
Yeah, so we just decided, we knew one home eder who ironically had just put her children into her youngest into preschool. So we had some sort of idea that it existed as a thing. And I actually sent her for another year of not preschool this time, proper nursery school on a farm. And that was a completely different experience for her. She had a great time. She emerged pretty much at the same level she went in. She was still an emerging reader, but now, shame, she was fully put off reading by the preschool she'd had prior. So her math skills seemed to be a bit better, but she was a year older than the other children in that cohort. So, and so I applied for an out of normal age range, and I was told that unless you had severe learning difficulties, that was never going to fly. But I fought with the school, and then I got them on technicality, which had nothing to do with principle or anything. It was just literally that they'd acted illegally in blocking me, and presumably some other people. So they were like, oh, I can see you really take a great, that was the mealy mouth way they said it, because you have huge interest in your daughter's education, be a real asset to the school. I don't think they could have meant anything less. But anyway, they're like, so for you, just this once, we'll let your daughter in. And so I took her to the school and I showed her it, and her dad and I sat down and we were like, okay, you don't have to go in. And you can go in a year earlier. She didn't really understand the implications of this at all. She's listening to all this and like, so what would you like? And she had a little broom in her hand and she tried to shove it up her dad's nose. And I was like, okay. So I said to my husband, I don't think this is going to fly. I think, we're not listening to her really. She has been saying no for a whole year. She doesn't want to go to school. She also, in the background to this, had been saying no to school from the beginning. She's very opinionated like her mother, and she has strong views, and she didn't want to, but that final act almost of desperation, like I'm going to assault you so that you take on board the negative feeling I have about this. I don't know why, but that kind of stuck in my head, and I was like, okay, no, it's a no. And so we embarked on home ed, and it was really difficult because I didn't know what to do. I didn't really want to do it. I'd been looking forward to some time off so badly. But it was the right thing. She was still waking up at 5 a.m. She was a done deal by 12. She wouldn't have had any benefit from the learning. The horrible confined spaces. You know, when you go to visit some schools and they've got this big green wire around the outside, and it looks like a prison yard, and you're like, is it to keep them in, or is it to keep other people out? And um, I was just like, I don't think that's not really what I want for my child. I didn't have go through all that drama of having a baby to release her into a prison yard 4 years later. So the more I was sort of going through it, the starker the contrast became, the less we wanted to go back. We always sort of kept an open mind, quote unquote. But as a result, my home editing has been a lurching. Like one moment I'm super focused. I'm like, yeah, we're going to do it this way. We're going to adopt this method. I research it. And then, life just happens. It meanders on. And we came across a brilliant curriculum, which I would highly recommend to anyone for those early years, called Torchlight. It's a non-religious, it's a little on the woke side, I suppose, but it's still got so many great book recommendations. Also, I then came to discover I didn't have the kind of optimal childhood where I could say, I know, we'll read loads of insert names of books. I didn't have that kind of childhood. I didn't have MOG. I didn't have any of those like touchstones of British childhood learning and education. Had none of those. So it was great to find a curriculum that literally said, here are the things little people like to read. And so we worked through it. It took me 4 years to complete their kindergarten curriculum because I'm so haphazard and I'm so easily distracted. But oddly enough, and now she's 13, so I've been doing this for, if we include the extra year of preschool or the nursery year, I've been doing it for 8 years. 8 years, is my math adequate? Yeah, and if we include, 9 years, and if we don't, I've been doing it for 8 years, I suppose. And I still don't know what I'm doing. But oddly enough, every year I do it, I'm more and more committed to it as a practice.
Has your opinion of schools changed? Do you still see them as, I tend to use, or sparingly, I use the term warehousing of children when it comes to schools. But that's quite harsh. Well, very harsh. But you mentioned prisons, which is even harsher. So,
yeah,
what is your opinion now of the school system, primary, secondary, early years, everything?
Well, certainly, I don't think that preschool is required at all. But my opinion of school, I think that schools are, the factory method that is used to assemble. I always think about the Henry Ford's innovation of factory methodology, where each person puts on just one component of the car and then turns out the car. And by siloing jobs to each individual component, you turn out the same little black car at the end. I think that's really how schools work. When you say factory, people often think, and especially coming from rural areas like I do, people always think in terms of the next word actually being factory farming, which is completely not what I mean. Like you're not like, it's more complicated.
You don't kill them at the end in an
No,
avatar.
you don't. So when I say factories, people often recoil. But what I mean is that every single person has a siloed task. Like primary is actually more complicated, and because you can move from key stages, but you become quite expert in like the year 1 or the year 6 or whatever it is. At secondary level, you're a subject specialist. And I use that in the loosest terms because most of the subject specialists I knew were not particularly, I'm going to sound awful here, were not particularly good at their subject.
I taught RE in schools, religious education in schools, for very briefly. And I was the only RE teacher that I ever met on any of the training courses or in any of the school placements or anything that actually had a theology degree. All of the others were just like sports teachers, or
Yes.
they just kind of get, I mean, I knew of maths teachers that had never studied maths. I knew of English teachers that actually were history, and vice versa. It's
that's
really,
a really
and
interchangeable one.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that this actually is necessarily a bad thing. In actual fact, I appreciate what you're saying about specialisms. I found when I was teaching that the ability to know how to teach something trumped your ability to know the subject because you have a book in front of you. So in actual fact, it was more about engagement. But I know what you mean. It is a bit unsettling, particularly with things like maths, where my son is very good at maths, and I remember thinking about putting him into school into college for his A levels, and I was not convinced that the teacher's maths would be as good as his maths, and I think
Yeah.
that isn't an unrealistic thought.
No, and you hear so many people talking about experiences they've had, especially at secondary school, of thinking they're bad at something, and looking back years later, having, and some people who are lucky enough to get to study it again at university or at a later stage, or change teacher at A level, will say, "I thought I was bad at that. What it actually was that the subject teacher wasn't any good, and when I actually found out years later they had a degree in geography, it made sense." Because I mean, some areas are hugely shortage. So, maths being one of them, has got a massive shortage of teachers. So you can teach people how to teach in a sort of one size fits all, but it isn't, it makes a bit of a mockery out of the idea that everyone is, they may be specialists insofar as they're specializing, but they are not necessarily experts, because I think people who are extremely good at maths are unlikely to start out certainly in teaching. And that's just common sense. I mean, if you could draw a salary from being excellent at maths, that's double a teaching salary, why would you elect to, or, go to some kind of tenure at a university? Why on earth would you elect to go and teach maths anyway?
Plus, a lot of these are actually now moving into tutoring. I
Yeah.
know that, for example, the tutor website that we used for our maths tutors, called Air Maths Tuition, they have, if you just scan your eyes down their tutors, they have tutors from all over the world, super varied, very diverse, very highly qualified. They're all
Mm.
sort of maths graduates. Most of them have written the maths books. I mean, they're really they're the examiners and everything. They're not teachers, they're tutors. And I think
Yeah.
that's one thing I really liked about home ed, was that when you're choosing a tutor, if you choose to use a tutor, and we use tutors for about maybe 30% of our subjects, you can really look at their credentials. You can't really go
Yeah.
to your school and like ask to speak to the maths teacher that your child has got and be like, where did you go to university? What degree did you get? How long have you been doing this? Because they'll be like, well, you're stuck with me.
Yeah,
You have
exactly.
no choice but to have me as your maths tutor. But
Yeah.
something you said earlier on was really interesting about this idea of a factory, because
Mm.
I remember when my children were about 10 or 11, for a bit of a laugh, I thought I would go to the local private school and just they had an open day. And I took my son and I thought I'd take him along just to see, and they had their blazers on and it was all very cute. Actually, I think he was a little younger than 10. He was about 7 or 8. And I remember we were being led around by the pupils. They love that, don't they? They love that, pupils showing you the parents around so they can show off their pupils
Yeah.
in the blazers. I didn't like it. I didn't like the whole vibe. But the headmaster at the end, I was asking about length of days, and it was something like 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, half
That's
day
fine.
Saturday for sports. It was really long,
Yes.
really super long.
Yeah.
And he was like, you can leave them here till 7, etc. And I must have pulled a bit of a face. And he said, the thing is, he said, you give us the child, and in 8 years, we give you the finished product. And I remember I walked out with my son and I was like, no way are you going there. I don't want someone to give me the finished product of my child. I want
Yeah,
my
I know.
child to discover their own finished product. But that's exactly what you're saying, right? Is this
Yeah.
idea of you put in the component parts and the school assembles them to an identikit end result.
Yes. And then they assess them to have met a certain standard or not against an entire year's cohort. And that is also really strange. Like, one of the things I'm sorry to harp on about maths, I have to say, I actually don't like maths as a subject in the slightest. But it's one that really stands you in good stead to have good maths. But one of the things is, like, 1 year you can be passing GCSE maths with such a low grade, and then another year you can be, the pass rate can jump, and it's based to some extent on the exam, but also based on the quality of each year's cohort. So if you have a cohort of children like lockdown children who are hugely hugely disrupted by things completely outside of their control, their performance is going to be reduced. But it doesn't mean that they've come out with a decent education. It doesn't mean that in 10 years' time, we won't find people working in the civil service whose mathematics is terrible, because for no reason associated with any fault of theirs, they've had a terrible year in which to learn maths. And so even doing that, even holding them up against each other, the competition, it kind of gets a bit sick in a way. The idea, my talking about school uniforms, my daughter could not cope with the idea that someone would tell her how to dress. And it makes me laugh because we get told all these sort of things as parents. When I became a parent of a daughter, I was like, I'm going to make sure I try and protect her as much as possible from all this anti-women ideas, like men have the idea to objectify. You talk about things have changed even further now, but the idea of protecting her from objectification, from feeling like she's in any way her body isn't beautiful and she's unacceptable. And then we go shove all our girls and all our boys into almost the exact same thing. And also, I don't know about you when you were at school, but I'm very curvy, and absolutely none of my school uniform ever fit me flatteringly. I couldn't, I actually, I looked hideous for the whole of the 5 years. So, when you become sort of aware of boys and things, and they're chatting up the girl who's got like the pencil skirt on, she's looking all well turned out, and you're there shoehorned into a disgusting A-line, nasty skirt, and you're feeling like, I couldn't, you feel simultaneously objectified and rejected by being forced into something in which, a bit like getting grades, you're going to fall short. So but the thought for her that you would, sorry, I've witted on there, but the thought for her that you would, someone would tell her what she could wear just amazed her. She'd be like, but I don't want to wear that.
For lots of children, there is a sensitivity to clothing. I
Oh my
know
gosh,
that I
yeah.
know that when I was young, I absolutely hated polo necks. I didn't
Mm.
like, I felt very, very constricted.
But
Now, the shirt and tie that I had to wear at school wasn't great, because it still constricted me a bit, but it wasn't awful. But I was
yeah,
regularly uncomfortable. And it
yeah.
isn't, if you look at, I mean, if you think back to what I was wearing, it was quite thick leather shoes. I know things have changed. It was woolen socks. It was quite a tight waistband. It was a shirt
Mm.
that dug in under the armpits, got super sweaty,
I
and then
know,
my
because it was designed
tie.
for a man or a boy,
Yeah,
rather.
exactly. And
Oh,
and I was uncomfortable a lot of the time, and I didn't like my school uniform. And I know that my both my children have at times rejected the even notion of a school because they'd have to wear a uniform. And in a
yeah.
lot of countries, children don't wear uniforms, of course. It's actually very much either a private school thing in other countries or it's a British thing.
Yes, it is strange as well when you give consider the quality of the clothing that goes into school uniforms. Because I saw someone a while ago asking on a forum somewhere, where do I find trousers that aren't coated in Teflon? And I thought, oh gosh, yeah, I'd forgotten about all that. When I thought that my daughter was going to have to start at school, I was myself suffering from quite a lot of chronic illness. And one of the things that people kept saying to me is, make sure you're not coming into contact with a lot of they're called forever chemicals now, but they're PFOS, anyway, Teflon was amongst them. And I went through and found out Teflon was in an awful lot of things. And one of them was these stain resistant clothing, which is great because children like attract stains, it's true. But all schoolwear now is so stain resistant, so coated in petrochemicals. Even socks, like they're anti-sweat and coated in something else. That is actually really hard to find something for your child that isn't. And the cost of trying to find a pair of black trousers for a little child that isn't coated in something is immense. But what they're made out as well, they're like synthetic from top to bottom. The only thing you have a hope of doing is wearing a pair of cotton knickers if you're a girl, because in the summer you're wearing one of those tablecloth style dresses. Maybe the little band around your arm is maybe polycotton if you're lucky, but the rest of it is just acrylic. Your socks are, maybe you're lucky if you get your socks cotton, but yeah, I mean, that's weird. That we would put our children in some of the worst quality available fabric that will actually could materially impact their health from wearing for 38 weeks of the year. That also doesn't make a great deal of sense. The whole thing makes no sense. The more you dismantle it from any given angle, like have children and then give them to someone else to raise, that's kind of a very antiquated model from an aristocratic system.
You're right about dismantling everything. When you actually start stepping back and dismantling the school system, it's bizarre. You have a child that you love very much, and then you don't see them for 8 hours a day, and then you give them to people that you don't really know very well. I mean, what do we know about any of the teachers? They're all very lovely, I'm sure, but we just don't know them. We don't even know their first names, and
Well,
we're not encouraged to know their first names, which in itself is interesting. And then
yeah.
they're kept in, like you say, a yard that has a very high fence, and they're told they're only allowed to talk at certain times. They have to put their hand up if they want to talk. Not something that we would accept as adults. Let's face it.
No.
They're not really allowed to interact with each other. They only allowed to play when a bell goes. I mean, the whole Pavlovian dog thing is just, yeah, it's ringing a
Yeah.
bell for me.
A bell rings,
And
my bladder is full, I must go empty it precisely at 10:15.
I mean,
think,
and
yeah.
not to mention, going back to the impact on girls, but actually, I will also into the impact on boys. So, firstly, when it comes to puberty, girls having to sit there for hours on their period
Mhm.
when they are in uncomfortable clothing, having to put their hand up to go to the bathroom, then they're going to have to take their bag with them, which of course immediately tells everybody they're on their
Yeah.
period. Then you have boys who have the entire struggle of unwanted erections that are sitting
Yeah. Oh,
there,
bless
and
them. Yeah.
it's can you imagine having to
It's just
navigate puberty in the
miserable.
school system?
Well,
Awful.
I mean, I did, and it was awful. I mean, I actually didn't know at the time, but I had endometriosis. So I also had a condition that didn't even have a name as far as I can remember, which was that my periods came really close together. So I only ever got a 15-day break between the end of one and the beginning of the next, and sometimes less than that.
Oh,
And so I was like roller coastering on hormones. I started my periods at 11 as well. It was a nightmare. The whole of my secondary education, people would keep saying she's great on a good day, but she's absolutely terrible on a bad day. And because it was such a taboo topic, the only people who even knew when my periods were and how it was a struggle were the PE department. Um,
yeah.
and it took them until mid-year 10, I think, to actually even raise it with anyone else as a possibility that this was an issue. They really couldn't have cared less about my welfare. I think they just read a circular from somewhere and decided, oh no, they were in charge. They suddenly got put in charge of PSHE or whatever it was called in those days. So they had a couple of, they were like, oh yeah, we recognize this, and they raised it for a couple of us. Nobody did anything about it, but I suppose it was kind of them to consider it. But that was absolutely miserable because I was in agonizing pain. And actually being being depicted as a whinger by people who don't understand a condition like endometriosis, being depicted as a liar by people who can't comprehend, including your GP, that your period doesn't run on an exact 28-day cycle like he was taught in his gynecology 101 1 hour lesson that he ever attended. It just it was miserable. It was horrible. And so at each juncture with home ed, I run up against a memory and I'm like, oh, fond memory. No, I don't have fond memories. That's another terrible memory. Even the people I went to school with, who I am very fond of personally, um, even they have a small element of trauma associated with them because we went through a terrible time together. And we have a bit of Stockholm syndrome related to that. It's really interesting. We all went to grammar school, girls' grammar school, as well as a particularly interesting environment in which to go to school because it's you're being it was a strange time as well because you're being raised. I always call it the Future Conservative Wives Club. You're being raised to be the vicar's wife, the MP's wife, the conservative, somebody who has dinner parties and who arranges, I don't know, bring and buy sales and make sure we've all got enough hymn books and make sure to balance the books for the parish council and all those jobs. So you need to be well educated. You need to know how to turn out well. You need to be a very good cook. You need to know how to mend because if you're going to be a vicar's wife, you're going to be poor. But you also need to know how to be a member of society, an upstanding member of society. And I think it's very telling that Margaret Thatcher is an ex-girls' grammar school girl because she had a bit of that about her, that she knew how to present. And that's a whole other world of like social manipulation. And it's funny now coming up for, in our mid-40s to see my friends, we can sit together and we can nudge each other in various directions, almost school style. We can, even though we don't share the same opinion, can all pretend to share the same opinion simultaneously. And it's really hard to actually, apart from me, they always know they can count on me for an opinion. I'm one of those people who barge into other people's conversations. So apart from me, but even me, I can go completely quiet in those situations, and suddenly discretion is the better part of valor out of nowhere for me. I'm just quietly like, yes, I agree, even though I don't agree.
Peer
And
pressure. Peer pressure in
that's still
schools
going
is,
well.
yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And I think partly that that also lends itself to this kind of identikit thing where slowly
Yeah,
your identity is eroded and you form a collective identity because it's how you survive the school system.
absolutely.
So, okay, so we all know the school system's crap. I mean, it's a home education podcast. I feel like we've got people on board
Let's
for
put it
this.
out there.
Yeah,
Okay,
let's just
let's
state it,
acknowledge
right?
that.
Otherwise, why would we be doing what we're doing? You know, I suppose
Yeah,
there's okay, everyone has lots of different reasons, but predominantly when you come right down to it, whether you're ideological, whether your child has rejected school, whether your child has had a traumatic school experience, whether you've not been able to put your child into a school for whatever reason, the actual core root of it is that the school system is broken. So tell
yeah.
me about home education for you. Have you transplanted your critical opinion of education from from the school system to home education? How have you found that?
Oh, well, so having been teacher trained and raised by a teacher as well, and taught by the teacher I was raised in the school that I attended, um, I was fully indoctrinated into it. So I spent, oh, I don't know, several years grappling with reality myself and the idea that I was going to have to replicate what went on at school for my daughter. Now, I did understand I didn't have to do it full time. I did understand I could take her out and go do things, but I tried so hard, and I still do to this day occasionally get like bewitched by a curriculum. Like, this is the solution to all my problems. It's become a bit of a running joke. But the truth is, there is no problem with letting your children do more or less what they need to do and want to do. You've just got to draw on some faith in the human evolutionary model that children know what they need and will work it out. And you don't have to worry too much. But yes, for years I had curriculum after curriculum. I could sit down and tell you so many different ones I've tried. And I've run up against two things. One, mostly my daughter doesn't want to do the things contained in any given curriculum. I just recently bought a square foot gardening curriculum. I was like, yes, this is the one. We are going to do square foot gardening because I like gardening. She needs to do a bit of botany type science. And we bought another curriculum of botany, and I need to justify that 35 quid I just threw away. So we're going to do this. Yeah, yeah. And she was like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going in the garden. Our garden is really small. I even bought raised beds because she was like, I don't really fancy all that scrabbling around the dirt. I was like, not to worry, I have raised the beds for you. And she said to me, listen, I hate flies, and there are a lot of flies in the garden. And that's true. She is a bit phobic of flies. And she said, also, I hate gardening. I was like, she said, and you know
It's
this.
hard though, right? It's hard to let go of what you want or your like ideas. Because I know, like you, I've bought many curricula and I've been like, this is the one. Like,
Yeah.
this we every day we're going to go for a walk and we're going to absorb nature and we're
Oh
going
my
to
God,
draw
don't
it
get me started on
Charlotte
that.
Mason style.
Oh, I
mean, it
love
was
Charlotte Mason, but it doesn't
we
work
did
for
like
me.
one day. I mean, it
Yeah.
was a disaster. And then other things like that they really like, I hate. Like, for example, what was that? Prodigy Maths. They absolutely adored Prodigy
Yeah,
Maths
but
because
it
they
wasn't.
didn't learn anything. I
No,
hated
no.
it.
I'm so
Their
glad.
behavior was appalling afterwards. So I pulled them off that. And then I'm thinking, oh no, like this is the one thing they've really engaged with. And it's a constant push-pull, I think, between wanting to make sure you've exposed them to as many opportunities as possible, but having to let go of all your expectations about how those opportunities are going to go.
Completely. And a fog does descend on me. And I suppose it's all the teaching that's gone on in my background, where I'm like, but what you want doesn't matter. This is what we are doing. Because, of course, when you're teaching like 150, 300, 600 children across a year, sometimes because timetabling means this, you don't any longer engage. You do your best with each individual class. You give them your heart for an hour and teach them to the best of your ability. But ultimately, you don't go anywhere near the idea that they've got that they have any personhood really beyond their each individual person that you can engage with for minutes at a time once a week. So the idea that your pupil would have their own wishes and desires, not to mention the fact that your pupil hates gardening, which you know, and because your pupil is not like 45 years old plus, they're not ready for gardening. You don't go near that. You're just like a fog descends on you. Like, this is how it's done. I know how this is done, and this happens to me regularly. It's like muscle memory almost. The idea that it's okay, I can handle this as long as I do it the exact same way as school does it, and that's usually when I'm at my most overwhelmed. And that's where the factory talk about a meandering point I've been making here. That's where the factory observation comes in, because I don't need to replicate a factory. It isn't necessary. The reason we're doing, especially secondary education, at the same level as a school is so hard is because you're trying to recreate a factory. You personally are trying to build an entire Model T Ford in your shed. That's the rough equivalent of doing that. Well, that's not going to happen quickly or efficiently. And who needs another Model T Ford anyway? The world has moved on. So
what you're saying is that when you home educate, it's a slower, more organic process, and you may end up with not a car at all. You may end up
no,
with a peach tree,
exactly.
something like that.
Your car will, in fact, halfway through the process, let itself out the back and go away, and you'll be like, well, I wonder what happened.
Where's my car gone?
Your car has views of its own. It doesn't want four wheels.
Talking of this idea of autonomy, and you were saying that we need to sort of trust in the child and have faith in the child that they will come to learning in their own way. Now, I know there will be people listening to this, and I count myself as one of these, who will say something along the lines of, that's all very well and good, but realistically, children need some GCSEs or some equivalent high school diploma, functional skills, whatever it is, BTECs, level twos, whatever you want. They need something on paper in order to either get funding to go to university or get a job. They need to fit. The problem with home education, I think, is that we broaden ourselves out wonderfully. Like for like 8 years, 10 years, we allow our child to just expand and do whatever they want. And then we have to bring them right back at 16 to this tiny little funnel and try to get them through it. Now, how do you trust and have faith in your child that they're going to suddenly develop a love for quadratic equations and allow them to get through their GCSE maths, for example?
So I've had to make peace with the fact that although I hold these opinions, I can't fully engage in, I am not an unschooler. I'm a slacker, frankly, some of the time. And I have a small, I'd like to think it's a small percentage of slacking, but it's probably higher than I'd like. I am a homeschool slacker. I just don't really want to school at home. So that's part of the problem. I also have chronic illness, which then upends. Sometimes I'll be like, right, time to start. And then I'm actually quite sick. So I'm not starting realistically. I'm in bed for a week. So that interrupts things to some extent. So then on top of that, I have absolutely, beyond my husband, who was slow to come round, but more or less accepted that in his absence, because he is at work every day, I was going to do what I needed to do and what she needed me to do. I had very little family support for it. So for many years, I've sort of been like almost presenting a report card to my family verbally, not at a given time, but they'll be like, how's she doing? And so I've always wanted to be able to say, oh, well, she's working at a level this, because they would understand that.
Because they're teachers, right?
Yeah,
so
they
come
understand.
from a teaching background.
They understand the word of levels. They understand the idea that she's working behind or ahead. I once did a reading level test on her out of pure curiosity, and she was reading at 3 years in advance of her age. Now, this is just an American reading level test. It's meaningless. It's based on a load of American children. It actually is utterly meaningless. But I told a family member, and they were like, that's amazing. But I said, you already knew that.
I did the exact same thing. When my children were about 10, 11, I sat them down to give them a reading age test. My daughter, who's super dyslexic, came through, I think she was 9, she came through as age 16. And it was like the holy grail for me.
Yeah.
I told everybody, I was like, look, I am not failing my children.
Yes, that's it. Because I think that they secretly, and I don't know this, think that I am. And they're tolerating me. And I am looking forward to the day when she's going to show them, because she will, that it's okay. And they will have to eat, some humble pie. In my head, they won't.
What will happen? What will happen is they will say, well, she was just very bright, and no matter what you did, she was always going to achieve. But think what she'd have done at school, they'd say.
Yeah, well,
think how good she'd have been if she'd gone to school.
So, yeah, I know. That is so true. That is absolutely the case.
Prepare yourself now for that disappointment when that happens.
I've already had it before when she went to her former nursery does 16 weeks to age 14 care. So she used to go to their summer thing. But she used to go, and people would say, she's doing so great now, she's going there. And I'd be like, she's not doing anything. And she's just, she's just growing, she's maturing. That annoyed me to have them credited with how well she was doing, because they'd somehow mysteriously through their summer school club like put something in that had made it work.
In actual fact, I have exactly the same experiences with tutors. For some of the subjects, we've brought a tutor in right at the very end just to do exam technique, or had a tutor like once a month, and suddenly everything is now about the tutors. What great tutors! Oh, you've had really good tutors. Oh, it helps that you can pay for tutors. It's like, no, that's like the tiniest thing. I've been doing this day after day since they were
Yeah,
like 3 years old. I've been getting the books and I've been taking them to places and I've been inspiring this and inspiring that. And
yeah,
now suddenly it's, 5 hours they had with a tutor. It's like, oh,
absolutely.
don't do that to me.
What I did in the end, what I've done, this is my latest innovation, is I found an online school. It took me a while to find one that I liked, because I wanted one that respected my family life. And most of the online schools now are sort of like, you can now attend assembly at 9 a.m. and then you can have a tutor group meeting. And then after that, you can work for 3 solid hours. Then we will permit you to have lunch. And then that's only an hour. And then there's all these lessons on. You don't have to attend live. But as you read more and more about it, it was like, if we don't see your face, we won't feel happy.
But
And
this is back to warehousing again, isn't it? This is
yes,
basically bums on
exactly.
seats, keep the children entertained for 7 hours so you can do your thing. They're sitting in front of their laptop.
Yeah, and preying so heavily on the insecurities of parents that their children are going to turn out into weird loners. So this, the answer to this is going to be that they attend, I don't know how many assemblies, they attend various clubs, they have, biannual meetups where everyone goes for like a residential. There's something else from the school system which I do not agree with at all, is residentials. At such young ages, especially, I think they're fraught with problems. But anyway,
It's the whole American summer camp kind of vibe. And I
yeah,
feel like, as non-Americans, I'm sure there are Americans listening to this as well, but for those of us that aren't in America, surely we've watched enough films to know how bad these things are, right? Do we
yeah.
need more evidence of how bad residentials are?
I don't think so. And I mean, as a child, I dodged one residential, but I have done a residential. I've also done a residential as a teacher. I was so sick. I caught the flu. And in fact, I've done several residentials, but this one stands out. I was so sick. I had to dose up on a well, they used to sell a brilliant cough medicine that was since made illegal because I think it has some kind of stimulant in it. And I had to dose up on that. I was so full of that cough medicine. I don't think I was legal to drive. Thankfully, I didn't have to drive anyway. But had I had to take the wheel, I couldn't have done it. There was 2 of us to 30 children away from home for 2 days. There were children who were utterly distraught. There were children who were asking, can someone come and lie in bed with me? Of course they can't, but they were missing their parents. And so it was actually really soul destroying for the woman, especially that I was with, because she was the parent of a 3-year-old. She'd spent 2 days away from her 3-year-old. She didn't want to be away from them, but she had all these distressed 11-year-olds. And so many of the more seasoned teachers were going, well, you've already done your year 6 residential. This is just your year 7 residential. It's fine. And it was horrible. So even from a teaching perspective, and I didn't have to eat the food particularly. I was so sick I couldn't have eaten any of it anyway. But it was just, yeah. It's got to feel like you're being taken away from your family for no really good reason. It didn't promote closeness. It just traumatized them, and the kind of trauma that you get from closeness isn't valuable. It's actually really, that kind of closeness, the kind of closeness you get from trauma is not valuable. It can be enduring, but it's harsh.
I agree. And I have to say as well that my 2 have never done any kind of residential, but I know that when they were sort of about 11 or 12, I dropped them off for a full day thing. It was super nice. It was like making a boat, also like actually like a big, it was like a project thing. It sounded lovely. And because it was the 2 of them together, because they're very close in age, I felt pretty comfortable. But what I did was I dropped them off. And like you said, and I think we don't acknowledge this enough, I was super looking forward to having a day to myself.
Yeah.
I had it all planned. I was going to go shopping. I was going to have lunch. I was really looking forward to it. So when I dropped them off, I did not do enough due diligence. I kind of dropped them off. I saw that there are a few, like quite a lot of children didn't know any of them, which is unusual. Normally I knew a lot of the home ed children didn't know any of the teachers, didn't really see any of the people who were running it. Dropped them off. They had their packed lunch. it was pre-phones. They didn't have phones on them or anything like that,
Yeah.
or pre me giving them phones, obviously. And I dropped them off, went to have my lovely day to
Mm.
myself, and about 6 hours later, I went to pick them up, and I got there a bit early. And I went into the room because no one's keeping me away from my children when I want to get to them. And
No.
so, unlike everyone else who was waiting outside, I went into the room and just I'm very brazen. I'm just like, don't even come at me. I'm in this room and you're going to have to
Yeah.
deal with it. So I sidled around the edge and stood at the back of the hall, and it was awful. It was like the worst kind of military school environment. No talking,
Yeah.
don't talk, shh, all of this kind of stuff that my children were very, very not used to because they've been
Yeah.
brought up purely home ed, very respectfully.
Yeah.
Everyone listens, everyone's nice, people don't talk disrespectfully to children. And
Yeah.
I remember afterwards, I was, even now you can tell, I can remember it.
Mm.
I was gutted. I was so angry with myself for putting them in. That they were actually okay. They didn't like it, but they were both there together. Now, if they'd have been on their own, I think it would have been a very different, quite a traumatic experience for them, because it would have been a sense of helplessness when suddenly
Yeah.
you're with all these adults who are shouting at you to be quiet when all you're trying to do is say something nice about the boat you're building or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And even just a day drop off at a different kind of environment can be really difficult when you home ed. Now, this brings me on to another point, and I will cycle back to what you're saying about online schools. I haven't forgotten.
Oh, sure.
But this brings me back to one of the arguments against home ed is that you're raising them in this completely unrealistic environment where everybody is respectful of them and everybody listens and everyone gives them autonomy and they can choose what they want and they can come and they can go as they wish. Now, my response to this is, well, actually, as adults, this is the world we live in. We choose if we want to stay somewhere, we have our boundaries, and we expect them to be respected, particularly actually as the new generations come through, particularly
Mm.
Gen Z generation that's coming through, very strong on boundaries and
Yeah.
wonderful at sort of like standing up for their rights. But so part of me thinks, well, this isn't the world, actually. This is just childhood and it's
Yeah.
unpleasant. And why are we exposing to this in childhood when then adulthood is not like this? But is there an argument for home ed not providing resilience, not providing mental resilience against challenges or unpleasantness or challenging environments around them?
That's a really interesting question. Does it? I mean, I don't see any sign amongst the home ed children that I know that they lack resilience. A lot of them are dealing with stuff in the background that's really hard on them. Life doesn't stop. You're inside your family, so they're dealing with bereavements. They're dealing with family friction and breakups sometimes, and they're dealing. They all got locked in the same as everybody's children in 2020 onwards. So I don't see any side of that. I mean, my own daughter's had to live with me as somebody with chronic illness that I didn't know about before I had my daughter. But all those diagnoses, all those surgeries happened during her childhood. It's just, I really think that the kind of resilience that they're talking about that's built up in school is really the resilience of trench warfare.
It's
To use
trauma.
it's
It's
trauma,
trauma.
and trauma is not resilience. And I have always felt very strongly. Years ago, I read, because I have almost certainly got undiagnosed ADHD, which, if anyone's listening, they might have picked up on by now. I only got to about 2/3 through this book, so it may have a conclusion that I've missed. So I want to preface that when if someone's read the whole book and they're like, I don't remember that aspect. One of the things it really harped on, what really stuck in my head was that the things that indicate poor outcomes for adults are often associated with a very traumatic childhood. And some of the stuff they sort of presented, which I've always had a slight issue with, were like the really obvious ones, like being born to a teen mum. Well, I'm not sure that was really, and that made a big focus of the governmental things at the time, was to reduce teenage pregnancies. I think missing the point that a lot of teenage pregnancies were perhaps the product, not all. I want to preface this because I know people have had children in their teens and this does not apply to them. But a lot of the teenage pregnancies they were thinking of were the product of abusive households, the product of neglect, and general parental indifference and all those sorts of things. They were conflating something that wasn't quite correct. But the actual point they were making was really sound. Like if you grow up in a home with in extreme strife and then go to school, school can look better from the outside because the extreme strife is worse than whatever's going on in school. And for those children, school is a blessing. But for a lot of sensitive children raised in functional households, school is 6 hours of not being understood, 6 hours of not being heard, 6 hours of having to pass for somebody you're not, 6 hours if you're autistic or even if you're not, even if you're just wired a certain way, of being overwhelmed by excessive sensations, horrible smells. I mean, school's just replete with horrible smells, nasty colours, nasty texture, nasty textures of what you're wearing. If you're struggling with attention, then school is incredibly difficult because you can't keep your attention on something, but at any given moment, you're going to be asked to regurgitate some information. I think it's trauma that dictates whether you're going to struggle as an adult. And therefore, I think if you reduce the volume of trauma that your children are exposed to in childhood, they are going to be more resilient, not because they haven't learnt how to deal with trauma, but because as adults, they'll have accumulated less trauma miles, if you will. And that's certainly my own experience. I think unnecessary trauma has shaped some of my own life, and I think it has fed directly into developing of certain autoimmune illnesses for me. And that has burdened me. And some of that trauma I experienced at school. And I'm that oblivious that I was actually quite prepared to feed my daughter into that system as well.
I think when it comes to trauma, because I'm obviously a therapist and I specialize in trauma, and I think that one of the things that really has come through of the last 20 years is how much our understanding of trauma has changed hugely. Not just the treatment of trauma, which is completely different, led by a lot of wonderful scholars who've now recognized that it's about the body and not the cognitions, but also just understanding the role of complex post-traumatic stress disorder and micro traumas and all of these things that I think if you'd have told us 20 years ago, we'd have been a bit dismissive of. We'd have thought trauma, you're talking about veterans, right? You're talking about survivors of you're talking about survivors of abuse. But actually, no, trauma is so much more complicated and it all gets stored deep inside you. And it does come out in autoimmune conditions, and it does come out in a number of kind of physical illnesses that we're only really now beginning to understand that kind of brain-body link, although it has been sort of talked about by leading biologists, Nobel Prize-winning biologists for sort of 40 years. But it's not a popular opinion, so it tends to get a bit squashed away. But the whole trauma idea, the whole trauma area is something I could talk about forever, but I will resist the urge. And actually, I believe we may have a podcast coming up with a trauma specialist, so that will be very interesting, I think, because I love a bit of trauma, they love a bit of trauma. We're going to be talking trauma. Let us cycle all the way back to online schooling, because you mentioned that you'd been looking at online schools, and we've actually done a podcast on online schools. And I would say that using the buzzword, it was robust, because I have a lot of opinions on online schools, and the person I was interviewing runs a directory of online schools where she separates them off so that the ones that have the assemblies and the full experience, and then the ones that just offer just like catch-up classes on different curriculum subjects. So tell us what pushed you towards an online school and how you're finding that experience.
So I was basically putting in a boundary with my own anxiety, because it was just getting out of control. This anxiety that I was going to be found, and it's totally internal. I was going to be found wanting in some way, and it chewed at me. Like I was going, not that I would let my daughter down, because oddly enough, I don't think that I would, but the anxiety that I was going to be found to have let her down, which is oddly enough definitely related back to school anxiety. It just got too much for me. So I decided I'd do what I end up doing a lot of the time, which is almost putting in like a placeholder. So like we're working on this, like my internet is broken, my website's broken down, there's a little workman on the front and he says, we're dealing with this. And I spoke to my husband about it quite extensively. And he was initially not sure, because he knows how much I don't actually like being told how to do things. But we eventually settled on something where we could not have to pay too much. She could basically have access to a maths curriculum and an English curriculum, work at her own pace. We only submit like an assessment at the end of each unit. There is support available, but you don't have to take it up. There is a sort of tutor at every term when on the FAQs, it was like, it would be like, what is the school going to do for my child's socialization? And they were like, you and your family are your child's socialization. It was sort of phrased more gently than that, breaking it to the anxious parent that they're responsible for their child, not the school. The school handles this tiny section, and you do the rest. And I liked that immensely. So I was like, oh, that's fine. As long as I'm not going to have somebody phoning me up to have X thing in by X point, I'm going to be okay. And so it was almost like if I had two people rowing with me inside me simultaneously going, what if you get really ill again and she goes for 3 months without doing anything? I should add, she's always doing something. She's a prolific writer. She's always got something on the go. She's very artistic. So there's never actually anything not going on while we're home editing. It just doesn't meet anybody's criteria. So it was a response to my own sort of anxiety and depression over the idea that I wouldn't be doing something. It's really ridiculous. She is currently coming to the end of the year 8 curriculum. So I just enrolled her in year 9 after I spent ages analysing them, because I do love a good curriculum. But ages analysing, I was like, this is a little simplistic, this year 8. Didn't look too closely at year 9 because I assumed it would be better, look adequately. I thought, that'll do. Oh, yeah, I heard you say years ago you couldn't see the point of Key Stage 3. Was it about a year ago?
I say it all the time. I feel like I should get it on a t-shirt.
I actually have to agree with you. I mean, Key Stage 3, certainly year 9, what an absolutely pointless waste of time. So now I've got to know these textbooks really well, and this curriculum. There's no reflection on the school, but the English one is hilarious. It's trying to teach you how to use quotations in your arguments. But I know come GCSE, it's going to tell you don't overuse quotations because you're just quoting somebody else's work and it's none of your own work. So they literally, and this feels to me like what school does every time, including with my poor daughter who's ready to read. They say, stop, don't do that thing you're actually ready to do, like make a sound argument and give just a minimal amount of quotation. No, instead, we want you to dial back and imagine you don't know, you're not interested in reading or writing for that matter, but let's imagine that. And now we're going to tell you how to do something. Then next year, we're going to pull out the rug out from underneath you and tell you, you now need to do the thing you were ready to do 18 months earlier. And for children like my daughter, actually, that can be catastrophic because she hates being told that she's wrong at something that feels right for her. And so, yeah, it's a really odd one now because she's point blank refused to do one of the courses entirely, which is so funny because it shouldn't be funny because I've paid for this course, but she was just like, no, I'm sorry, I just don't like this. And I said, well, it's French. And I said, well, would you like to do it a different course? And she was like, no, it's a bit like the gardening. I had failed miserably to truly consult her. I had decided, I'd set myself a set of standards like a teacher, like a manager. I decided what good schooling would look like. I'd consulted her about one thing, which she said yes to. She's never fought me on English and maths, in fairness to her. And then I just made the decision about French entirely myself and decided we were going to catch up, because I can do French. We were going to catch up all of this French in 1 year, maybe 1.5 years. And she was just like, I'm sorry, I can't do this. I just don't want to do this. It's not that she's incapable of it. She just doesn't want to do it. So another parenting fail. But the weird thing is, in the background, what it's given me is that when we have these periods where she's actually angling to sit down and binge watch something on TV, and I'm like, that's not going to happen. Like I can leave you to be bored, or I can, and I suddenly say to her, why don't you do a bit of your English or maths? She actually just pulls it out and gets on with it. And so by the time I arrive at time to be for my annual inspection report, I'll have something, my placeholder, we're working on this website, it's going to be saying, here we are, we have enrolled in this online school. She's getting core subjects and some extras. In the background to that, though, she's actually carried on doing more or less what she was doing originally. Talk about a success I didn't foresee. I bought an £18 humanities geography course. She loves it. She absolutely loves it. And I'm really, but I can't push it too far. I know she'll resist me if I try and encourage her to take a GCSE earlier or anything like that. So that's kind of how I found my way to online school. And honestly, though, I don't necessarily recommend it, but I think as a way to hold a boundary with your own anxiety. If you're
Yeah.
lucky enough to have the kind of child who will push back on you because they know there's no consequences, pushing back on me, the worst case, I'll be like, oh, I'll be like, oh God, I've done it again. But, it's not like I'm going to say, well, that's it now. We're not going to have a holiday this year because you've had the temerity to have your own opinions. I know it's me that's done it, me that's caused this issue. If you're lucky enough to have the kind of child who will push back, then you could probably experiment with an online school. I really do think so much discussion about education ignores the fact that, one, children are still growing. They're literally burning synapses. So 1 year, something won't embed, and the next year it will go as easy as anything. And that we're in teenage years, you enter this period of exponential academic growth. They're actually capable of an enormous amount between 14 and 16, 14 and 18. You have to be really careful not to squander it purely on academics, to give them the chance to hear the beat of their own drum, to do the thing they're really interested in. And
so
to
much as well is emotional development at that time, and just their
absolutely,
hormones going off, and then recognizing the wider world and starting to make links not just with their immediate wider world like their social world, but also with the wider world when it comes to geopolitics and social activism. And I think a lot of this time, if they're just head down in books, it's such a shame. uh,
yeah,
I think it's a shame that children aren't given more free space, head space, brain space, emotional space, just to learn how to interact and allow themselves to explore connections with the world. Before we finish, Helen, I wanted to ask you about funding, because I know you have opinions on funding when it comes to home education, and it is such a thorny topic in the home education world. And for anyone who's listening who doesn't get involved in the back and forth on the home ed Facebook groups about this, let me just try to summarize it in a few lines. Some people think that home education should be funded because why not? It's expensive and we're saving the government lots of money by not putting our children into schools. Other people say, well, it's a choice we're making. Plus, if you were to do that, it would then mean that the local authority are much more likely to want to see what they're getting for the funding that they're giving you, and it would just give them more input into the home education journey, and we don't want that kind of scrutiny. That, I feel like I've summed it up rather nicely. So where do you stand, Helen, on funding?
it's a strange one. I really resent interference from government bodies in anything that I do. Where funding is concerned, I have a bit of an issue because it seems to me that the government sucks in an enormous amount of tax revenue from us in every single way. But the other day, just going shopping, I think we spent about £200 because it's at the beginning of the month. And I thought about it and I looked at it, I thought almost all of this stuff is vatable. And that means that of that £200, just one sort of early monthly shop had £40 of tax in it. So I just paid the government 40 quid. Every time I refuel, I pay them 40 quid. My gas bill is obscene. My electricity is as well. 5% of that, every time I pay it, is VAT. If you drink, you're paying a huge amount of everything we do is taxed, which means that even if you don't have any income to be taxed, you're still paying tax in everything you do. And I think home editors are entitled to get some of that tax back, because I don't necessarily think there's any argument for any government interference in it at all, because we are saving enormous amounts of money for school. I mean, if every single home editor had to turn their child into school now, there would be a funding crisis of huge proportions because the schools couldn't afford to take them on. I think having to pay for exams is something I feel especially angry about. I wouldn't wish to be dictated to, but I don't necessarily think that they would. I think as a basic right, I can't see why home educated children are excluded from having their exams paid for. I don't get that, because every child has the right to an education. I've delivered my education for my child, or will have delivered by the time she's at GCSE level. Why suddenly is she excluded from having her GCSEs paid for? That just doesn't make any sense. I can understand why people would be worried that the government would interfere. My bigger worry is that some third-party organisation would set themselves up as arbiters of what a good education looks like, and then they'd inspect, and it'll be like the benefits system all over again. I mean, when several years ago, Frank Field, I think it was, did like a big analysis of the benefits system, or like he invited testimony from people who had to use it, and it became apparent that most of the benefits system is inspected by third-party huge corporate entities,
Mm.
who make decisions about individual people's lives based on a set of criteria that got nothing to do with their lives, who get in third-party practitioners who've got nothing, so we had people with immense psychiatric difficulties being assessed by a physiotherapist and found fit for work. That's the sort of thing that worries me. That worries me, that will create a racket. And from that racket will come, I don't know how much, that the funding that we individually should get and be allowed to choose how to spend will be diverted into these big companies who will assess it, be diverted to a big organization that will dispense it. That worries me. But as a basic point of principle, I think all of us should demand to have our exams. Our kids should be able to have their exams paid for in whatever they want to do. So if they wanted to go and do a completely vocational course from 14 to 16 online, that should be paid for. Because why should they be excluded from having the qualification? If they're going to insist that our children have qualifications to progress, then home educated children should not be excluded from the process of getting those qualifications.
I feel like that should be on a manifesto somewhere, but yeah.
It's
So
really obvious. I mean,
it is, and there's no doubt that exams are extremely expensive, not to mention A levels, which I know anyone who listens will know that I've just put my son through. Ridiculously expensive,
yeah.
thousands of pounds. No, you mentioned there about there's gonna, that there's a potential for a kind of racket organization to come in and start creaming off profits from the home education sector. And I wondered very, very finally whether you have an opinion on the very controversial topic of private organizations or private tutors or businesses coming in and making money from the home education market by advertising services, or whether it is helping people write their home education reports. I saw a teacher recently advertising this, not a home educator, a teacher. Whether it is home education coaching, whether it is tutors that specialize in home education, or businesses that help you sort of deal with your local authority. How do you feel about that kind of aspect?
I think any teacher writing a report are just going to have a laugh about this. Like, they've been writing drop-down reports for donkey's years. I mean, they wouldn't be able to write. I mean, no offense, but I mean, even when I was doing it, it was tick box, and you were very much encouraged to write no more than 5 lines, which, given how much I can go on, was a real pain. So yeah, that makes me laugh. Yeah, I have actually got experience, and it is negative, and I'm sorry to say this, but I have got experience of third-party providers, and in my particular part of the country, we have third-party providers putting on meetups for children, neurodivergent children, and taking funding centrally. I'm not sure what. I've sort of tried to gently inquire, but I can't really get a clear fix on how much. But taking central funding from our local authority for putting on these meetups, then they advertise them into the whole community and invite everybody to come to them. But actually, if only neurotypical children arrive, they wouldn't get their funding, because the funding is for the neurodivergent children. Now, what I'm seeing are really mainstream offerings. They're not even suitable to home educated children. Everyone's sitting together and doing the identical craft, which just, firstly, home ed children don't require crafting as a general rule. They have plenty of craft at home. It is like everyone's go-to. It's like everyone has a cupboard full of crap that can be turned into craft at any moment. So that's firstly the thing. The other thing is it's sort of like very regimented. That again, as a teacher, there's someone at the centre, and there's a lot of very lost-looking parents on the outside who just have no idea. They would very much like their children to be in a school setting. You can see it. Their children have huge needs, and the provision, just this like paltry piecemeal provision, is giving the illusion that these children with these complex needs are having their needs met. And it's also blocking out just very normal home educated activities where we have a smattering of children with neurodivergence. We have a smattering of home ed children who are themselves a particular type of divergence from everything. So you couldn't classify them. But they rub along really nicely together. They build up communities. All the parents are still involved. People don't drop off and run. We've lost a huge chunk of that, and we're losing it because these organized activities look appealing, but they're not. And they're sort of somehow managing to block out just the sort of more organic aspects of home ed meetups. So I actually
Mm.
feel very strongly, very, very strongly, that the children who these are being put on for primarily are being massively let down. And I know why they're doing it, because it keeps them from having to actually find those children a space in a school that's suitable to them. It keeps them from having to pay a fraction as much as it costs to cater that to that child properly. But, on surface, it looks as though they've ticked a box.
I think that inclusivity of home ed meetups is something that I have seen all the way through. This idea that there's 20 children. No, well, it's never that many. There's like 10 children, home ed children, and I don't know. I don't even know what percentage are neurodiverse because it's never something that's even a thing. It's
Yeah,
just all the children mixing around, and it's always been like that. And I think it's only really as my children got older and started going to after school things or things where there was a mixture between school children and home ed children that they realized that there were things that were specially put on for neurodiverse children, or where there was like a kind of like, oh, okay, so let's cater differently for these people. It was, and in the home ed world, it generally is just all muddled along in a very inclusive way, isn't it?
and the parents are actually involved as well in supporting the child in the home ed community. A lot of parents who've made a decision to remove a neurodivergent child into the home education sector, they may struggle for a while, but they are aware of how to support their child in a mixed setting. What I'm noticing with the parents who are what I would describe as unwilling home educators to an enormous extent is that they don't know how to do it. I mean, if you're really unlucky, you'll have someone who just turns up and drops their child off in Scarpers for 2 hours. Now, I don't blame them. I would probably I freely confess to trying to find the right environment to leave my daughter for periods so I can have some time to myself. So I do get that. But the people running these things, they're inadequately qualified. They don't really seem to have much of an affinity for children with neurodivergence. It's not the same as a school where, I mean, when I was teacher training, I worked with somebody who worked across a comprehensive with a full range of abilities and also what was called at the time a special school. And actually, our children with more challenging aspects to behavior and academics in the comprehensive mixed back and forth with the children from the special school. And so the children, it was a very free moving thing. Everybody was extremely well trained. The ratio of adults to children was very, very, very low. And even as a person training to teach, I was taken through extra training. I was told what I could and couldn't do. I was taught about restraint because it did become an issue. When you bring your home ed child into an environment like that, where they're there meeting new children, and there's some nonverbal children. I never forget my poor daughter. She's about 9 years old. Really looking forward to seeing some other 9-year-olds. And she was sitting next to a child who was completely nonverbal and who was finding any attempt that she was making to interact with her absolutely traumatic. And there was no parent there to explain for the child. The teacher was just doing that thing that teachers at the front will do when they don't know what to do, which is just sort of ignore it and hope the person doesn't blow up. And then it didn't happen to my daughter, but another child was, I won't say attacked, but there was a very distressed boy in this instance sitting at a table, trying desperately to manage his own distress, and then eventually just lashed out at the person closest to him. We in the home ed community, none of us is trained, none of us knows what to expect with these things. But
But when the
what's
parents
happening.
are there, I mean, this is what I find is that in the home ed community, it is standard that the parents are
Yeah,
there, and that's good and bad. I think it's good for all those reasons you mentioned because the parent understands their child and is able to
absolutely.
advocate for them. When the children get older, I think it's less good because I think children, particularly teenagers, like to have time with other teenagers without their parents
Mm,
there all the time. I think that idea uh, of inclusion and diversity is one thing that in the home education community we take very seriously and we're very good at. And I think that when it comes to third party businesses or whatever, it's sometimes when you home educate, when you take your child out of the school setting, you have a kind of weird, really uncharacteristic deference for people with, as Shakespeare said, like a little brief authority. And so,
mm,
whether it is the teacher that's become the tutor that you don't question because they're a teacher, so they know what they're doing, but actually the tutor lessons are a bit crap and they're just delivering a lesson plan and it's like, why am I paying for
Yeah.
this? Or
Yeah. Oh
whether
my
it is a
gosh.
drop-off event where you're like, why can't I stay? Like, what's
Yeah.
the problem with me just sitting at the back on a chair? All of these things. I think sometimes when we home educate, you'd think we would be super feisty against authority figures, particularly educational authority figures, but sometimes we're not, because I think
Mm.
we're kind of hammered into us that, okay, they're doing their thing, we're doing our thing. So if we're going over to the dark side, and
Mm.
putting them into one of these classes, we have to accept their rules. And I don't think we do. And I think we need to learn to advocate really much more strongly for actually the fact that what we're doing isn't wrong. In fact, it's right. And maybe
Yeah.
they're the ones who are wrong. And maybe we are the trailblazers who are doing it right.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's very true. And I would say as well, the providers as well of things where they used to provide, for example, just a very mixed home ed forest school, are now very focused on those neurodivergent children. So they're either trying to incorporate, with no background or training, neurodivergent children into settings like a free-form home ed forest school, which, as you can imagine, is like a cat herding experience. But it's its own thing. And it runs well. They're completely ill-equipped to manage with somebody who, for example, has a Tourette's syndrome. So you've got all these little children running around, hearing the foulest language from a child who's completely overwhelmed, who there's no parent, there's no authority figure, and this person is completely at sea. But they're making good money from it. So they're not going to, and the presence of those neurotypical children, in a way, also makes it, I don't think neurotypical is the right word, to be honest with you. The presence of these other children with these other adults makes it look a lot more of a safe environment for the child who's struggling than it actually is, because all of those parents are not focused on that child. They're focused on their own children with a peripheral awareness of that child, but it's not the same. And what's happening for us is, you'll say, can you put on XYZ for us? And they will be, but they want the same funding that they're getting from the governmental funding stream. We can't any longer afford to hire the halls, because where they were 10 quid 5 years ago, they're now £30, because that's what the local authority will pay towards the hire of the hall in which the thing is delivered.
It is another example, I think, of how the home education community is shifting like sands every year.
Mm.
Changes so much. I know that the first big changes I noticed were around about 2015, when there was a lot of off-rolling, and then
Yeah.
COVID, just round about COVID and just after COVID, another huge shift in the demographic of home education and why people were choosing to do it and how people were doing it. And I think in some ways it is scary, and it's very scary for people who've been doing it a long time, because they
Mm.
see their community shifting and evolving in ways that they're not comfortable with. And in other ways it's very optimistic and dynamic and positive feeling, because it's like, look at this amazing, growing, evolving community, and kind of going along for the ride is interesting, and it's fascinating to see where the ship takes us. But I'm afraid that is our time up. So Helen, thank you so much for all of those opinions. Thank you for coming on and being honest and brave and sharing all your thoughts with us. And I hope you manage to navigate your way through GCSEs in a way that
Thank
keeps your
you.
anxiety nice and low.
Yeah, I'm sure I shall lurch through them, but I'm confident we'll produce a result at the end of it. And the more years I do it, the more I'm aware of that it's the right choice. And I think it's the natural choice for the vast majority of people if they let themselves be open to it.
I completely agree. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. And thank you
All
very
right,
much
well,
for the
thank you.
opportunity.
No, it's really fun. I enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
You. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.